Now, in this historic election,
The 2024 campaign is in full swing.
Kamala Harris demands respect. If it's not given to her, she demands it.
We who believe in the freedom to live safe from gun violence will finally pass universal background checks and red flag laws.
Donald Trump a chance to go out the winner he must be.
If we come up with something, we're going to do it and we're going to replace it.
The countdown is on for the U.S. elections slated for Tuesday, November 5th, 2024. As the campaign storm heats up, the stakes are high and various key issues are expected to shape the political landscape. In this edition of The Perspective, we shed light onto these factors and look through what is expected as the election day approaches. Joining me today is Johanna Leblanc, a national security law and foreign relations expert based in Washington, D.C. Johanna, thanks for honoring my invitation today.
No, thank you so much, Sam, for having me. I look forward to a productive conversation.
Thank you. How is Kigali for starters? Is it your first time in Kigali?
It is my first time in Kigali and certainly won't be my last. It's a beautiful city. I look forward to seeing more of the country. The food is great. The people are kind. And I think His Excellency is doing an incredible job at maintaining this country. I see the streets are very clean. It's a beautiful city. And I think it's a testament to your strong government.
Thank you on his behalf. I'm lucky that you live in the U.S. and you're definitely familiar with the politics and the political landscape in the USA. Can you give us an overview of what this election feels like?
Well, it's a very, it's an unprecedented election season in the country. You have a black woman of Indian descent who is running for the presidency, who could potentially become the first woman and the first woman of color president in America. And that is significant in a sense that America has not had a woman president. We look at the African continent; it's actually much more advanced than us in terms of women in leadership. You have Malawi had a woman president before. Currently, Tanzania has a woman president. Ethiopia had a woman in charge, which she recently left power. So I think when the United States talk about equality, when the United States talk about gender equality in particular, for the country to have a woman in power, I think it will send a strong message to the rest of the world. And I think you will see more women across the world ascend to leadership positions across the African continent.
Okay. How do you see the political landscape evolving from the previous elections?
Yeah, so again, here you have two candidates, right? You have a former president who's running, Donald Trump, and you have Vice President Harris, who's a current vice president, but was not the candidate initially. It was Joe Biden. And at the very last minute, Joe Biden announced that he would not run for the presidency, and he endorsed Vice President Harris to run for the presidency. So you have a candidate who's had about 100 days to become president, to campaign. And right now, as we speak, she is sitting on $1 billion of money that she has raised. That tells you the number of support that she has from the establishment. But at the same token, Mr. Trump also has support. His base is galvanized. His base, they're committed to him. They're committed to his stance when it comes to issues around immigration, which is one of his strong policy position. When it comes to his stance about how the economy is currently doing under the leadership of President Joe Biden. So there's a lot at stake. In this election right now, we don't know who's going to win. It's 50-50 as we speak. But what we do know is that Vice President Harris has a great deal of support. I mean, you see different groups coming together in support of her. You see White Men for Harris. You see LGBTQI for Harris. You see Black women for Harris. You see lawyers for Harris. You see all these different groups from all different communities coming, wanting to rally behind her because they want to see a woman in leadership, and obviously they don't support the other candidate, and they support her policy too, obviously. But this is going to be a very interesting election season, and I think the outcome is going to shock us, irrespective of who wins.
Okay, nice. What do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of the current frontrunners?
I think the strength of President Trump is that this is a man who, irrespective of how you feel about him, this is someone who is committed to getting what he wants, right? This is someone who, to his audience, right, to his supporters, he's a nationalist. He's patriotic. This is a man who dodged two attempted assassinations.
Yes.
That is significant in the history of America, and I think from a global perspective, it's not necessarily the best for the country because it shows to our adversaries that our security infrastructure may have some gaps, right? And it could cause our adversaries to take certain actions that I don't think the U.S. would want. So there's that. And as I said earlier, his people, his supporters, are incredibly committed. No matter what Mr. Trump says, he can sit and get away with it. But another strong point that he does have is the immigration issue. I mean, America is a land of laws. We have international laws that protect folks if they were to come to the border and they're seeking asylum. There's a process for that allows you to come into the country legally, right? But there are those that are merely seeking for better economic opportunity. And unfortunately, under international laws and domestic laws, we don't necessarily have a process for those categories of people, right? So Mr. Trump has a way of telling the American people that the reason you're not doing well is because those folks are taking your jobs, right?
Yeah.
The reason why your community has a lot of crimes because they're coming in and they're committing the crimes, which is, by the way, not true.
Yeah.
The data show, when you look at the crime rate of immigrants or in comparison to the crime rate of people who were born in America, the numbers is just doesn't support what Mr. Trump says. That's just a reality. But Mr. Trump will tell whatever needs to be told in order to win the presidency. But in terms of Vice President Harris, I think that one of her strong points is that she's younger, definitely.
Yeah, sure. The age
right?
is on her side.
She's younger, yes. And then she's very, at first, people had some concerns about whether or not she could pull it off. But I think since the announcement, I think there's been a major shift in terms of how people look at her. I think people look at her as a potential president of the United States. And I think she's a very accomplished woman in her own rights. I mean, this is a woman who was a former U.S. Senator, the second Black woman to hold such position at the United States Congress. She was an Attorney General for the state of California, and so on. And those are significant positions, and they're really hard to attain. She's a lawyer, and one of her strong points in terms of policy is reproductive rights, making sure that the rights of women to access reproductive services are accessible to them. As you know, after the United States Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, many states across America put in a number of restrictive laws that makes it illegal for women to have abortions. And Vice President Harris believes that women should have the right to determine what they want to do with their bodies. And there are some instances where an abortion is a must. Like if a woman is raped, if the child came out as a result of incest. So I think with reproductive rights, she's really good. I think that with the economy, she's also good. She made a proposal that she would provide a tax credit of $25,000 for first-time home buyers. I don't think that's enough, but I think it's a good start in the right direction. Yep. And it will be in form of a federal program in the country. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, these are domestic policies that could shape the outcome of the election. How about social factors such as gun control? How do you think this can affect because they directly affect the population, the general population? So such social factors, you think are also, can you weigh in on such factors, on how they could affect the election?
Yeah, well, we have a major crisis in America when it comes to gun violence. Far too many Americans have died because of guns. And obviously the Republicans and the Democrats differ on how they see this gun issue. The National Rifle Association spends a great deal of money lobbying both Republicans and Democrats to ensure that laws do not undermine their interests in terms of selling weapons across America and across the world, quite frankly. So it is an issue, and I think Republicans believe that guns don't kill people. It's people who kill people, which to a certain extent that I can agree with that. And the Democrats think that while I think some do believe that it is guns that kill people, not guns per se, but what Democrats traditionally have proposed for is stricter gun laws to make it harder for people to access, to buy guns, right? And also providing access to mental health, because I think there's an element of that, right? If someone gets up, grabs a gun, and goes out and shoots people, something's wrong mentally, right? And we have to be frank, and I think that's the part of the conversation. Sometimes that is kind of frustrating to a lot of people, because that is the reality. Yes, you have people who are evil, but I think a number of those people who have committed those acts, I think it's due to mental health. So we do need, as we're talking about gun control, we need to ensure that we provide access to mental health for people who might be dealing with these types of issues. So do I think it's going to it's going to impact election outcome? Certainly, because the Second Amendment is a very controversial topic in America. And Americans love their guns. They love their guns, and they don't want restrictive laws that would impact their ability to access their guns and buy their guns.
So that's a challenge because it will affect the voter base.
Yeah, there's a segment of the U.S. population that is really concerned about the Second Amendment and what the Democrats could potentially do if they do have power. And a number of legislation have been introduced in Congress to restrict access to purchasing guns that did not actually materialize, because as you know, with the United States Congress, the majority right now is Republican under the leadership of Speaker Johnson. So if the bill can't get through the first phase, which is the House of Representatives, and then the Senate votes, and then Senate sends it over to the president for signature, then it's impossible. So with a Republican leadership in the House right now, it has not been easy for the Democrats to actually address the gun violence issue.
Yeah, let's talk about the foreign policy.
Yes.
What do you think will be the most pressing challenges, foreign policy challenges for the next president?
So in the context of the African continent, since I'm in Rwanda,
Yes.
I think the U.S. is playing catch up. As you see, China, for the past decade, has been the continent's largest trading partner. And if the U.S. is to maintain its status as a global superpower, it must reassess its relationship with the African continent. And it cannot be a relationship that is based on humanitarian assistance solely. It has to be a relationship that is based on investments, key investments in key sectors across the continent. But most importantly, it is rather important for African governments to lobby the United States government to ensure that laws coming out of Washington are mutually beneficial, not just for the United States, but also citizens of the African continent. That is imperative. When you see things happen in Washington, when it comes to certain nations, it didn't just happen by accident. It's because they have people on the ground who are working for them day in and day out, knocking on doors, speaking with members of Congress, speaking with State Department, speaking with the financial institutions, speaking with the White House on their behalf continuously. So making a couple of trips to Washington and meeting with this, a certain high-level individual is not sufficient for the African continent to get the outcome that the African continent deserves, right? Because Africa feeds the rest of the world. without the continent, the rest of the world cannot function. That's just the reality with the critical minerals that we have and so on, and so many other. And I always say this, the continent's greatest resources are its youth, right? It's a continent of 1.4 billion people. That's a tremendous asset that the continent has as we're talking about negotiating with the United States about various policies that would support the economic growth of the continent, because that's important, which is why I'm a major champion for the AFCFTA. I'm here for the AFCFTA Business Forum. And also, too, when you talk about the renewal of AGOA, right? The renewal of AGOA is a trade preference program, and I think it's been outdated. It needs to be, as we're talking about renewing it, we need to ensure that it is a trade preference program that is consistent with the Africa that exists today, not the Africa that was 10 years ago. And we need to ensure that it complements AFCFTA and not undermine AFCFTA. But I think that, again, if the U.S. wishes to maintain its superpower, there has to be a shift, because I do believe that Africa has always been an afterthought, not the front and center when it comes to the U.S.'s agenda, and that has been a mistake. And I think that this administration has acknowledged that, which is why this administration created the an executive council with some of your most prominent people of African descent to advise the administration on way forward on how to better strengthen both bilateral relations with various countries and also trade relations.
In fact, you talk about AGOA. I've seen several African countries being excluded from this AGOA program. Just even in the neighborhood in Uganda, a few years ago, Uganda was also excluded. But the U.S., of course, always gives reasons. They have their own reasons, human rights violations. They have all the reasons for their decisions. So I don't know how it turns out, but I will just be here to see what happens.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the things that I talk about, Sam, is that as we are looking at a renewed AGOA, it is imperative that we remove these kind of restrictions, because when you keep these restrictions, as a nation that is looking to advance its national interest on the continent, you're actually creating a vacuum for your adversaries, your opponents, such as Russia and China, to come in. Yeah. So we need to completely remove some of these human rights language, because the reason why Uganda was unfortunately removed is because of an LGBTQI plus legislation that was passed by the parliament, which means by the people of Uganda, and signed into law by President Museveni, which is the will of the people. And for the United States, and I understand, irrespective of your position as it relates to LGBTQI+, I think the rights of LGBTQI+ people around the world must be respected, because there are people like everyone else, and there are international laws to protect the human rights of those. And I think in many countries there are also domestic laws to protect human rights. But if we're going to be talking about trade, let's focus on trade, right? And let's remove the barriers. And there are other ways I think the United States can be more strategic in addressing some of what the U.S. deems to be human rights violations. Because when you remove Uganda from the program, what happens? It's the people who suffers, right? Because companies that were doing business under AGOA, they've left and have gone to other nations because the environment is no longer conducive, because they were not able to reap the benefits. So what happens to the women? The vulnerable population that were working in these sectors.
Of course, they're the ones.
Now they are unemployed. So we have to look at the unintended consequences of some of our foreign policy decisions. And again, if we're really looking to maintain a better relationship with the African continent, I think there needs to be a major shift.
Yeah. How do you see the U.S. relationship with its allies or rivals like China and Russia shifting depending on who is elected?
When it comes to Russia, as you see, Mr. Trump has been very vocal about the war between Russia and Ukraine. Mr. Trump maintains that if he were in power, we would not be here. This wouldn't happen. And this administration, the Biden administration, is a huge supporter of Ukraine, and we've sent billions of dollars to Ukraine to support Ukraine in defending itself from Russia. But it's also a way to also try to weaken Russia's influence, because we see that Russia has some influence on the African continent, in other parts of the world. But to answer your question, how would relationship with those countries differ under different governments? I think there will be some differences, because Trump believes in America First policies. Let's not worry about what other nations are doing. Let's take care of home. While I do understand where he's coming from, but our societies are gravely interconnected. And if you are to maintain your stance as a superpower, you can't just focus on domestic issues. You do have to focus on foreign policy issues, meaning that partner with your neighbors, partner with your allies. Like under Trump, he withdrew from NATO, indicating that they weren't paying their fair share. I think that was a mistake, and I think these types of policies that just don't support what the United States is looking to achieve ultimately, which is to maintain its role as a superpower. We've seen a decline, unfortunately. That's just the reality. Whereas I think with Vice President Harris, you will see more involvement across the world, across the African continent. You certainly will see more sanctions, a more focus on human rights violations. You certainly will see that. You talk to some folks on the continent, I think some would prefer a Trump presidency versus a Harris presidency for those reasons I just mentioned, because the Biden administration will remain a strong proponent of respect for human rights, which if there are cases where the U.S. has evidence to support there's been a violation, there will be sanctions. That's just the reality. So
yeah. Now, so I want you to shed some light on the process of how the U.S. elections are conducted. There is, unlike other countries, unlike in Africa or in Europe, the U.S. elections are conducted in different phases, in electoral colleges, then voter turnout, again at some point the public also participates. I want you to predict something. How will the voter turnout play in the outcome of the elections?
Yeah, voter turnout is very significant in this case, especially in the swing states. As you know, there are so historically, usually since the Vietnam War, American elections rather, have always been determined based on domestic issues. There's a shift this election cycle. I think foreign policy issues is going to play a role. In particular, the conflict between Gaza and Israel. You have folks from America, right, different parts of the United States, who are uncommitted to the Democratic Party right now because they don't support what is happening in the Middle East. That's just the reality. And the reason why that's a problem for the Democrats is because if those folks don't turn out, because I think voter turnout it's going to be a very tight election. It's going to be a very close call. If those folks don't turn out, it's going to be an automatic vote for Mr. Trump, for the Democrats at least, because we know the Republican, the base, they're going to come out in numbers. They're galvanized. They're committed. They understand what's at stake for their party. Whereas with the Democrats, I think, because we saw this happen 2016 with Hillary, some folks didn't come out, right? And it did impact the election. Ultimately, Mr. Trump won the presidency. So for the first time since the Vietnam War, I think we're going to deal with that. And then you also have your people who are just currently just still undecided. And it's kind of interesting because for where we are this late in the game, I think that people should know where they stand. And I say this because there was a poll done after the last debate between Mr. Trump and VP Harris, and they had asked, folks, had their position changed after watching the debate. And many people said no, they still either their choice maintained, or they weren't sure which way they were going to go. But just to put it out there, generally, those debates don't really have much bearing on.
Actually, I was about to talk about
who
the
wins
debates.
the election.
Do they really have any?
They don't have any bearing. The average American doesn't even watch them. And the reason why they became popular is because of Trump, by the way. Because Mr. Trump, when he ran in 2016, the American public had never seen a candidate of his nature, of his personality type, a candidate who just said what was on his mind. And a lot of people resonated with him because of that. They felt as though he was speaking the language of their uncle, their grandparents at the barbecue. Like, wow, we want to tune in. And during the primaries, folks were engaged. They were watching, right? And which had never happened before. Usually it's during the general election that people kind of get involved and try to figure out what's happening. But yeah, so I think foreign policy would play a critical role in the presidential outcome. And it's going to be a tight election, which is why Vice President Harris and the Democratic Party cannot afford to not bring folks to the table. But for what they're asking her to do in terms of shifting policy, it's not going to happen. Yeah. It's just not going to happen. That's the reality. So.
What trends do you see developing as we get closer to the election day?
Well, you see there's a great deal of misinformation campaign on social media.
Yeah, fake news.
Fake news, right? On X, on Instagram, on Twitter. That is very, very problematic. And I think it's fake news on both sides. So there's that. And then people are getting more intense. And I've never seen it that way before. It's either one or the other. It's kind of hard to have a conversation, a balanced conversation about both candidates, about either candidates, because people are very passionate about their views. So yeah, I think the misinformation is a big thing, and then in terms of another one, I think people, especially young people, are galvanized. But they want change. They want change. They want change. They like Vice President Harris because they feel like they can resonate with her. But the student debt crisis is a big issue. There are those things that they want their potential president to address. And I don't think some people are quite happy with some of the policies that's been proposed by Vice President Harris in terms of addressing their day-to-day needs. I mean, inflation is high. The cost of gas is expensive in America. So there are a lot of challenges that must be addressed. And I don't think there's been a great deal of policy proposals on how those issues will be addressed on behalf of the American people.
Yeah, Ivan, I want to ask you one final question. In your own honest opinion, what is that one thing that you see as the determining factor of who is going to win this election?
That is a good question. That's a good one. That is a good one. I think voter turnout is going to be significant, especially in the swing states. Yes, it's going to be very significant. So folks have to go out and vote. Ultimately, it's important. So I think that, yeah.
Wow, thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you for your insights. Thanks for your knowledge. Many of our viewers, I'm sure, are not so familiar with the U.S. elections. And if they are, these are very useful insights that you've given us that they can also build on to understand much more of international politics.
Absolutely.
I look forward to seeing you again.
Absolutely.
Whenever you come back to Kigali or when I come to Washington,
Absolutely.
we should definitely link up.
Absolutely. I would love that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Our viewers, thanks a lot for your time. Thanks for your company. We look forward to seeing you again in another exchange, in another good debate. Feel free to suggest what you think we can talk about, and we'll be here right to do that for you. Thank you so much. God bless you, and God bless Africa.